Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Community and Infrastructure Services Committee meeting of February 13th. And welcome. Is there any declarations of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof? Councillor Michaud?
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Yes, I am declaring a conflict of interest on item 5.1 as a family member lives in close proximity to this project. If I could ask for a moment to make some comments.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to take a moment and express my personal disappointment that I am not able to participate or vote in this matter. With the issue coming before Council early in 2023, I reached out to the Integrity Commissioner to determine if a conflict may exist. Given my personal circumstances, I was advised it does, and I'm obligated to follow the professional legal advice. While I would always prefer to be able to engage in the decision-making process for matters within my ward, acting with integrity and upholding respect for the rules that govern our office is important for all members of Council and my ongoing work as your elected representative.
Thank you, Councillor Michaud, and you will be required to file a written statement with the clerk. Thank you. Any other declarations of pecuniary interest this evening? Okay, I will request a mover for the consent items, please. Thank you, Councillor Davey. And will all those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'd also like to introduce a new staff member this evening, or new to their role this evening, and it is our new Interim Director of Engineering, Carlos Rice. Am I saying your name correctly? Oh, wonderful. Well, welcome, and thank you for being here this evening. Okay. We will now move on to Ms. Saunderson, now that we've voted on that, I don't move through 3.1, or I?
Through the chair, you've considered it and moved and carried all the consent items, so you can move straight into the discussion items.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. We'll start with the delegations then. For item 5.1, the Bean Drive and Sanitary Trunk Sewer Extension Class Environmental Assessment and the Environmental Study Report DSD 2022-188. Delegations, I would like to remind you, all delegations have some guidelines for participation. If you conduct yourself in any of the following manners, it will result in an immediate removal from the meeting, interrupting councillors, staff, or other delegations, derogatory statements about councillors, staff, or others, hate speech or defamatory comments, and please do not take offense if there are no questions from council following your presentation. This is council's time to really listen and reflect upon the opinions and ideas shared with us from our community members. And now we'll start with Steve Taylor, we'll call in the city's consultant, Steve Taylor from BT Engineering, who will provide a 10-minute presentation on this matter. Or Mr. Reich, are you going to introduce?
Yeah, I was just going to introduce.
Yes, please go ahead.
Through you, the chair. Development Engineering hired BT Engineering to conduct a Schedule C class environmental assessment for the Bean Drive extension and sanitary trunk sewer extension. This would take Bean Drive from its current terminus to future Robert Ferry Drive. And I'll hand it over to Steve Taylor, and he can walk you through the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to describe briefly the overview of the outcome of the Class C Schedule EA completed for the project. If you take a look briefly at the overall study area, there's a small study area where the project's going to be constructed. There's a greater, broader study area that actually take a look at the downstream effects of the projects. There's 4 different neighborhoods that feed traffic out of the existing conditions, and they share the load through different locations that come out to arterial roads. The new road connection will actually provide relief from the Bean Drive South community, taking it from traveling through other communities. And it was the transportation component of that needing justification. So why do we need the road? It's to distribute traffic to the arterial road network from those 4 communities. They all get to share the load. We also needed to provide a sanitary and water services to the corridor that's been planned for over 30 years, both of which these projects have been identified in previous planning documents. Background information, the project has been documented in the official plan and transportation master plan that preceded the environmental assessment study, and the new road link will accommodate all modes of transportation as well as municipal servicing. We have completed natural and social environmental inventories within the study area to provide a background of existing conditions from which we assess different alternatives. Part of the Class C process is to have meaningful consultation with the public, stakeholders and First Nations right holders. We completed the 2 public information centers as part of the process. We included a study design that exceeded the requirements of the municipal Class EA. Following the first PIC, the members of the community asked us to consider a different alternative to be compared fairly with the alternatives we had developed to date, which it was. And then we came back to the second PSC to show the results of the comparison of the alternatives and the evaluation of the alternatives. And we also had an on-site meeting with the 6 Nations in February of 2022 to walk the alignment and get their input as custodians of the environment. These are the alternatives that were developed. They included 3 that were identified pre-PSC 1, so they're shown in the yellow, pink, and orange. The 4th one was an alternative that was added after PIC 1, going down Carringdale. It included both a road connection for traffic to divert on that alignment, but the sanitary sewer to go through the provincially significant wetland. This is alternative 1, shown in greater detail. The broader PSW is off to the top and the left of the slide, so the location of the crossing has been planned from early days to be located very close to the edge of the PSW. This alternative was one that there's a hydro transmission corridor. It was identified to be to the east of the transmission line tower base. It provided greater separation to the roundabout that's located at Strasbourg. The second alternative went further into the larger area of the wetland. It located the alignment to the west. The transmission tower had poor performance for both natural and social environment and provided the location in closer proximity to Strasbourg roundabout less desirable. So the alternative 4 that was carried forward, as I described, was one suggested that trips that were generated in the Bean Drive South community have alternate route to leave their community utilizing Carringdale. Issues with this alternative is that it created traffic to go down a minor arterial, whereas the Bean Drive corridors that we saw in alternatives, the first 2 alternatives utilized a major collector road designation that's been carried in with the city. It also included traffic to be diverted to a different community and going past the elementary school. It did include you see the thin line off to the left. It was the location for the sanitary sewer, which had been planned for this community for a long time and is in the municipal plan for municipal servicing. We carried forward the alternatives. We used a very comprehensive analysis and evaluation exercise. It went through a weighting exercise to prioritize the competing alternatives. The alternative one was the one that was preferred amongst the three that were compared. We went through sensitivity testing, looking at a range of the weights that were used by the evaluation group. Alternative one consistently rated highest. This is the recommended plan. It includes a reduced right-of-way width as we go through the PSW. It includes a sidewalk and multi-use path. It includes a wildlife crossing under the corridor for travel under the road. This shows the cross sections. So part of the mitigation plan as it goes through the wetland area was to shrink the cross section width. So it goes from a 23.5 meter cross section to an 11.5 meter cross section as it goes through the PSW. Again, there'll be a wildlife crossing under the corridor as it goes through the wetland, and it includes a sanitary sewer. So these are some of the key questions that were asked to us. Why is it being implemented now? So the reason that it's being implemented now is that we now have a connection that will be available to Strasbourg Road, which will allow the Bean Drive South community to actually exit to an arterial road system without going through one of the other three neighborhoods to exit the community. It's also required to then accommodate the future development that's in the sanitary sewer that's going to go through that area. And we needed to identify the alignment so that land development could occur to the south. Important questions: are the wetlands protected? So we deal with this in other similar transportation studies. The provincial policy statement does allow municipalities to plan for transportation, utilities, and municipal infrastructure within provincially significant wetlands if there's a completion of an environmental assessment to document the need, mitigation plan, and it's been implemented in other projects like this by our firm through the province. It has an exemption from the development restrictions that are in place for developers. Are there any species of risk identified as being present? So we have completed field work, BT and WSP, and haven't identified any species of risk within the wetland. We've committed to EISs at the date of future implementation during detailed design, which will identify any species that are identified at that time, and they'll be mitigated. We've made commitments to the Six Nations for mitigation of lost trees within the right-of-way as well in the wetland. Why do we have to have a trunk sewer on the Bean Drive alignment? It is the only natural path that's been planned for the whole community, for the greater sanitary sewage area, sewer shed that feeds this area. All the alternatives we considered included the sanitary sewer to go through this corridor, and it must flow by gravity through this corridor. What's the nature of the Indigenous studies and findings? So we've completed archaeological investigations, stage 2. They've been shared with the First Nations that were participants in the EA. They've been submitted to the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, new ministry name in 2022. But there was no archaeological sites that were identified within the limits of the project. And again, we've walked through the site with the Six Nations. Their focus is on mitigation of environmental issues. Where do we go from here? We have a draft ESR that's ready for filing. It'd be a 30-day public review period. If we receive a resolution from council tonight, that council resolution will be included in the ESR documentation and be available for public review and for the MECP to have the documentation. So with that, back to the chair. We'd be happy to answer your questions now or later in the evening.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and I would actually ask council to hold their questions to consultants and staff until following all of the delegations this evening. So, thank you.
Okay.
And next we have Mr. Paul Britton from MHBC, please.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, Council, staff, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Britton. I'm a local planning consultant. I'm appearing this afternoon on behalf of Hallman Construction and Sunvest Reed, and they're the owners of land through which the proposed road is to be extended. I would say from the outset that I'm appearing in support of the staff report, and you have before you written submissions with a chronology, and I don't intend to get into the detail because there's a lengthy history. Needless to say, I've appeared before probably 4 councils on 6 separate occasions to speak to the need for the road, which is quite well documented in the consultant's report. Next slide, please. I think the first point I would leave you with is that Bean Drive is part of an integrated transportation system, and it's a system that deals with roads, pedestrian connectivity, and community connectivity, and that system has been planned together. The road is required to serve a broader southern community of Kitchener, which includes at least 3 to 4 communities. Next slide, please. In terms of the system, if you disconnect one road or don't approve one road, it has a ripple effect with respect to the balance of the communities. Importantly, Brigadoon North will be disconnected from Brigadoon South. The connectivity to Strasburg Road will be diminished, and that's significant given the millions of dollars of infrastructure investment that has been made. And traffic will be diverted to other communities, most importantly the Carindale community and Robert Ferry Drive. Next slide, please. In terms of historical context, you can see that dating back to, this is 1994 consolidation, but at least 1989, Bean Drive was identified as extending through the wetland. Importantly, you can see that there was an intersection that was planned within the wetland, and what is shown as Street C was intended to provide for additional connectivity to Strasburg Road. Next slide, please. The community plan was updated, and you can see that Street C was eliminated, the intersection was removed, all in terms of for the betterment of the environment and to minimize impact. And subsequently, the lands were redesignated to open space from residential, and that open space land has since been conveyed to the City of Kitchener. Next slide, please. What I've done here is compared the 2005 official plan with the 2014 official plan, which is now in effect, and you can see a couple of things. One, Bean Drive has always been shown as an extension because the need had been justified at least on 5 previous occasions. I think most importantly, you can see that Strasburg Road, the connections to Strasburg Road, there were at least 4 to 5 connections, and with the elimination of the Street C collector road, those connections have been reduced to 2 to 3, emphasizing the importance of Bean Drive as that connectivity to Strasburg Road. Next slide, please. Currently, you can see that Bean Drive terminates as a cul-de-sac, which exceeds the city's standard cul-de-sac length on a single point of access, and was never intended from a planning perspective to remain in that condition. Next slide, please. Much of the focus in terms of input to this ongoing EA has been with respect to specific impacts on the wetland. My submission to you is that the impact should be considered from a broader systems-wide perspective, and it would be my submission that Kitchener staff as well as Kitchener Council over the years have done an excellent job in terms of protecting the environment as broadly defined. There is a reduced environmental impact, next slide please, a reduced environmental footprint associated with some roads. Robert Ferry Drive has been downscaled to a front-loaded collector road. Robert Ferry Drive has been realigned to avoid 500 Stauffer Drive, which is a designated cultural heritage landscape. And all that has allowed for the conversion of a number of roads to scenic heritage roads and pedestrian trails. Next slide, please. As I noted, the elimination of one of the planned collector roads has achieved the protection and city ownership of approximately 20 hectares of woodland, associated environmental features, including wetlands. Next slide, please. I think what I would say and end off by noting is these trade-offs should not be dismissed their important trade-offs when the overall road network was planned together. Next slide, please. I think we can skip over the heritage slide. So in terms of my summary and concluding remarks, it is tempting to consider the impacts of Bean Drive in isolation from the broader base system. I think that is somewhat misguided. Bean Drive has been planned as part of an integrated road and pedestrian connectivity network, and Bean Drive was never intended to be terminated as a cul-de-sac. It was always intended to be extended through the wetland and connect to Strasburg Road. With that, I thank you for allowing me to go over time, and I have my submissions, and I am available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Britton. And we're holding questions until after, so if you want to have a seat.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, Council, we have 10 delegations this evening, 9 in person, and there's one written submission from Alice, and I just want to make sure the spelling here, is it Eugen? My apologies for pronouncing that incorrectly, so Council can take a look at that as well. So first we have Ms. Bonnie Bender-Vargas. Please. And welcome, Ms. Bender-Vargas.
Thank you very much. Chair Johnston, Mayor Babinovich, and council members. We are here to speak to you about the proposed extension of Bean Drive through the area of Brigadoon Woods, known as Provincially Sensitive Wetland 30, hereafter referred to as PSW 30. It should come as no surprise that the majority of the neighborhood does not believe this extension is necessary, especially considering the loss of invaluable, irreplaceable green space. In fact, many residents chose to live in the area specifically because of this green space. We say this collectively, recognizing the problems facing our community today, the fact that new residential developments necessitate an increased focus on 3 pillars: safe roads, resilience, clean water, and sanitation. It's our belief, based on extensive review of the environmental assessment done on behalf of the city by various consultants, more recent data, and research from leading environmental scientists, that the extension of Bean Drive can and should be deferred until the connection of Robert Ferry Drive to Strasburg Road is complete. In our group's presentations today, you will hear from knowledgeable and passionate members of the community who will illustrate 3 key points. Our roads do have capacity to remain safe for all users with both existing and projected traffic without the Bean Drive extension. PSW 30, beyond being a pleasant green space teeming with endangered wildlife, plays a critical function in protecting the community from floods, and any development through it puts all homeowners and residents at risk. Modern engineering solutions enable us to build the water and sanitation services we need without disrupting the environment. And perhaps most importantly, I have for submission today a petition with over 500 signatures from local constituents impacted by the decision made here today, which reads as follows. We, the undersigned, are opposed to the extension of Bean Drive through a Class 1 provincially significant wetland, hereafter referred to as PSW 30, for the following reasons. Further review of the existing transportation studies fails to find proof of the need for the road extension. A road through the PSW 30 will result in saltwater runoff, which will likely result in the destruction of the habitat of the cold water trout and any other ecologically sensitive species in the wetland. The development that will result from the road extension will put additional pressure on our groundwater and aquifers, from where the region of Waterloo draws 70% of our drinking water. Therefore, we are requesting a deferral of the Bean Drive extension until Robert Ferry Drive is connected to Strasburg Road. At that time, a new transportation study can be performed to collect updated traffic data to determine if the Bean Drive extension is necessary. For this petition, we canvassed the entire stretch of Bean Drive from the cul-de-sac at the south end to the old Huron Road at the north end, along with Carindale Road, the Hearthwood area south of Brigandon School, the Carindale area east of Carindale Road, as well as streets feeding into Bean Drive, including Robertson, Kilkerran, and McLeod. The response at the door was a high degree of awareness of the planned extension, as well as overwhelming support for the deferral of the Bean Drive extension until after the completion of Robert Ferry. We collected over 500 signatures, both in person and online, with 80% of those being door-to-door and 20% online. It can also be noted that there's a large number of attendees this afternoon, both virtually and in person, as this decision affects many of our neighbors and friends. In conclusion, during the April 14th State of the City address last year by our mayor, we heard these statements: build a better Kitchener together. We are the stewards of the land and protection for future generations. Focus on going green to protect our environment for future generations. Working together with our citizens. Step up, speak up, and raise your voice. Be engaged. We believe, along with 500 and more of our fellow neighbors, that the existing traffic data for Bean Drive does not provide justification for the extension of Bean Drive. Paving a road and trenching a sewer through PSW 30 will cause irreversible damage to the ecological system, and completing the sewer and water trunk infrastructure can be done with modern, non-disruptive engineering solutions. We call on you to strongly consider the information that will be presented here today, which we believe is in support of deferring the extension of Bean Drive until the extension connection of Robert Ferry to Strasburg is complete and updated traffic surveys show a genuine need for the Bean Drive extension. I now will present the signed petition to the clerk. Sorry, I don't know your name, but here you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Bender Vargas. Thank you so much. Thank you. And I will remind people here today, and thank you. It's always good to see people in our council chambers, but if you could refrain from clapping whenever people present, we'd appreciate that. Thank you. And next we have Ms. Jennifer Arruda, please.
Can I assume I'll ask you to advance slides? Okay. So, thank you, Mayor and Council. My name is Jennifer Arruda, and I'd like to speak on the issue of extending Bean Drive. I'm hopeful that my boys here will be able to observe the successful civic process of constituents bringing their concerns to Council and our suggestions being heeded earnestly. So obviously there's a number of considerations for this project because of where it's located, some of which are listed there. I'm only going to focus on the traffic and transportation arguments that have been made. In the November 17th PIC that occurred, we were told, and also again tonight, that we needed to evenly distribute traffic through the arterial road network in this neighborhood, and that traffic volumes in any one neighborhood needed to be reduced and improve access. Also that a sanitary and water service corridor was needed, but I'm only going to focus on the traffic arguments. So the key classifications that we're talking about are based on the Transportation Master Plan for Kitchener. Bean Drive is a major collector, which can hold 5,000 to 8,000 cars, Carindale being a minor collector to 2,000 to 5,000 cars, and minor arterial plays into the conversation a little later with 8,000 to 20,000 cars. We were told, went too far. BT had indicated in an email response to us that the extension of Bean Drive will result in a more balanced redistribution of area traffic volumes, providing relief on other area roads, including Carindale Drive and the north segment of Bean, which are currently both overutilized. I have lived in this area for over 30 years, and when the extension was recently proposed to go forward, it took the community by surprise. We hadn't had a need for it in all this time. Why now? The need for this extension has leaned on in part by consultant predictions from decades ago. Some of these now have no relevance as we have actual and recent data, and these are the streets that we'll discuss. Robert Ferry was originally a minor arterial road, or at least planned that way. The EA specifically states that higher traffic numbers can be expected because of that. It also mentioned that extending Bean Drive to Robert Ferry would exceed the desired amount of traffic for that road. Its latest numbers, I think from 2019, were about 2,000 cars a day. So that brings us to Carindale. Is it too busy? It's the home of Brigadoon Public School, which is close to my house. They saw a very small increase in traffic. The red lines on the graph represent the low and high range of traffic that's expected on the street, and as you can see, Carindale is objectively not being overutilized. Was Bean Drive too busy? From Carindale to Kilkerran, which is the more south end of the street, cars have actually decreased over the years in that section. The north end of Bean, which was measured between Marl Meadow and McLeod, can go up and down by hundreds each year. So not steady growth and also not being overutilized. So what this tells us is that we're not seeing a requirement for area roads to need relief at this time. I did mention Templewood and Marl Meadow because there's the data that we do have shows them not even being close to the minimum of range for that classification of road, and there is no need to redistribute the traffic. So it seems that from a traffic perspective, extending Bean is not actually needed. I look forward to a decision from Council that takes all this information and our concerns to heart and considers seriously the solutions we are about to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arruda. And if we could now have Ms. Kelly Kuzik, please. Welcome, Ms. Kuzik.
Thank you. Chair, Mayor, and Council members, my name is Kelly Kuzik, and I am a Ward 4 resident and an original owner, having lived near Bean Drive for over 33 years. When our home was built in 1989, information was shared about extending Bean Drive at some time in the future to allow for traffic flow as the area grew in size. As Brigadoon Phase 2 was a new development at that time and just completed, there was really no discussion with residents as to what this proposal meant or how it would be implemented. My own thinking was that more homes would eventually be built along Bean Drive. However, I did not have a full understanding of the watershed lands and the eco-sensitive environmental impacts beyond the current development at the end of Bean Drive. As this area in question was basically on the outskirts of Kitchener at the time, I don't believe even the city understood the uniqueness of the forest, the streams, the extent of the wildlife, or the grading of the land. In any event, this proposal was simply put on the books as a future consideration and not really spoken about until about the last 10 years with the rapid development of the Doon South community to the south of this area. 33 years later, and there is no new proposed development on Bean Drive. Yet now the city wants to extend Bean Drive and disrupt a relatively quiet street that comes to a dead end with abundant green space and wildlife. On Carindale Drive, development has been slow and phased in over the last 33 years, including the Hearthwood Hills subdivision, which has not developed further in the last 15 plus years. All in all, prior to 2010, the housing development and traffic flow had been fairly limited. In the years since then, the Doon South community has exploded with development, and we have noted a definite lack of roads leading west out of the area. This missing link west is what is causing increased traffic on Carindale and Bean Drive, as previous traffic studies have shown. Since then, construction traffic has slowed down, but residential traffic continues as people look to access Strasbourg and Huron roads in the fastest way possible. The Robert Ferry extension to Strasbourg Road is key to solving this problem for those traveling west from Doon South. Further, it is also my understanding that when the Hearthwood Hills development is completed adding many new homes. Another arterial road will be put in that subdivision to either access Robert Ferry or to join Strasburg Road. With the completion of Robert Ferry to Strasburg Road and this new road in place, I have every confidence that traffic will naturally divert itself out of Dune South and Hearthwood Hills respectively in a much more direct and efficient way. As a result, the need for the Bean Drive extension will become redundant once Robert Ferry is connected to Strasburg Road, creating ease of traffic flow. Thus, with no Bean Drive extension, residents' significant concerns with the environmental impacts, increased traffic, and the anticipated speeding along Bean Drive will be alleviated. We have been told that the Bean Drive extension has been proposed with the thought to improve traffic flow in the area, when in reality, the increase in traffic west is coming from the Dune South community. The completion of Robert Ferry to Strasburg will solve this concern. Extending Bean Drive will actually have a number of devastating impacts to the environment, as you will hear from others who are speaking tonight. My request of you for consideration is twofold. Propose to put the Bean Drive extension on hold until the Robert Ferry extension is completed to the roundabout at Strasburg Road. This will allow for appropriate and more updated traffic studies to be conducted in the area. And I am very confident that this will show a vast difference from the traffic studies that were conducted a few years ago. And two, consider what other road or roads may be developed from the Hearthwood Hills subdivision once additional development begins, so that this will also allow better access points out of that subdivision, again, to alleviate increased traffic on Carindale and Bean Drive. In closing, we appreciate that development may need to move forward, but the focus must be on a solution that protects our wetlands, allows for appropriate traffic flow, and does not create new problems where they don't currently exist. We can honor our environment and some of the most beautiful and environmentally sensitive lands in southwest Kitchener by deferring the road and finding solutions that benefit all parties. Thank you. And I too have a...
Thank you, Ms. Kuzic. Next we have Mr. Mike Funk, please.
Good evening, Mayor Verbanovich and Council. I want to talk to you today about the importance of coldwater brook trout habitat. Scientists estimate brook trout have lived here for about 10,000 years. They arrived when the glaciers melted, followed the water systems made in the glacier's wake, and produced populations in the pockets of newly created stream habitats that were cold enough to support them. Not every area of the province has water naturally cold or clear enough to sustain them. Chris Bunt is a biologist who owns the fish monitor and research firm Biotactic. Working throughout North America, he has been working on the Grand River watershed since the mid-1990s and has watched the number of cold water creeks in the area sharply decline. Through a Ministry of Natural Resources permit, an electro fishing count was performed on the habitat closest to the possible road extension alignment. It was determined that over 500 brook trout resided in this area, and we believe that should the road extension occur, it will be the demise of these habitats. These are threatened types of habitats, and you can't get them back. You can't restore a cold water stream. Once they're gone, they're gone. A Canadian study is added to a growing body of research that shows residue from vehicle tires contains a chemical highly toxic to several important species of fish. In a newly published paper from the University of Saskatchewan, toxicologist Brinkman says that chemical is toxic to trout species in concentrations no greater than a pinch of salt in a swimming pool. The study found that even small concentrations, such as those regularly occurring in surface waters from a stormwater runoff, were fatal to brook trout. It only took 0.1 micrograms per liter concentration to kill 50% of the brook trout within 2 hours. Cold water streams are lost when their groundwater recharge is disrupted. This mainly happens when recharge areas that facilitate movement of precipitation to the water table are paved over trout habitat. Underground, the water flows according to the topography of the water table. A cold water stream is created when groundwater is forced by pressure to discharge into the stream, says Hodgins. It comes back to the fundamentals that despite everyone's best attempt, when you create engineered structures, you only at best mimic what was there in the natural environment. You cannot replace it. Infiltration water systems, also known as SWM ponds, have requirements, but may not be enough to preserve the region's last cold water streams. Salt is toxic to the environment along roads and in surface waters. It accumulates in the environment where it can impact dissolved oxygen in water and kill off or harm species with low tolerance for salt, says Hodgins. When applied to surfaces like roads, sidewalks, and driveways, salts dissolve and make their way into the groundwater aquifers beneath the surface. Warming cold water streams indicate disruption in groundwater recharge of the streams, but also potentially of the aquifers the region relies on for drinking water. Brook trout are truly the watershed touchstone in our area. When we lose brook trout in our streams, it's telling us we did not manage the land well and our water supply is at risk. Here's a picture of trout or stream rehabilitation. Here's some of the impacts of development: underscouring of trees, tree roots, and resulting in loss of tree canopy and shade to cool streams and trout habitat. This community needs the Kitchener City Council to consider not disrupting the PSW 30 to protect the city's drinking water and the surrounding ecological habitats. Why defer Bean Drive? So I just want to update my note here. We realize the Bean Drive extension has been on the book for decades, but in that time, our understanding of our impacts on this region have grown significantly. Reviewing statements made by experts, we can see that the disturbance of the groundwater will have a direct impact on Strasburg Creek. Salt and other contaminants from the road extension will continuously filter into the groundwater, which feeds this Strasburg Creek and is the habitat for cold water brook trout. Future development must have an additional buffer between the property line and the PSW 30 and eco-sensitive areas. It is the plants and trees that create the microclimate needed to hold the water and allow the slow infiltration into the aquifer and vernal ponds. Directional drilling needs a hard look where the road just isn't needed. We are in a climate emergency. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Just that my girls are here, and this is their planet that we're trying to protect, okay? This is what we're doing. I ask you to consider directional drilling and not look at your pocketbook. Let's be part of the change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Funk. Next, we have Mr. Tom O'Connor. Welcome, Mr. O'Connor. Yeah, if you could maybe move the mics up a little bit, or try and speak.
I can always lean over.
Okay, that's good. You can speak
I'm pretty
closely
loud
into
too,
it.
so it should be good.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Magic. Dear Mr. Mayor and Council, thanks for listening to us today. The American biologist and poet Drew Landman has said, I believe the best way to begin reconnecting humanity's heart, mind, and soul to nature is for us to share individual stories, and that's why we're all here today. We are a diverse community of young and old. We are connected to the lands that surround our homes. We walk the forests and paths, and we pick up garbage. We are the stewards of that land. The future stewards of this land are in this room today, and they climb pirate ships of trees. They're inspired by the turtles, the frogs, the deers, the rabbits, and all the other elements of nature that live in the Brigadoon Woods. These young stewards bask in the beauty of our world. They learn the meaning of life and the tranquility of nature. While we are a generation that beg young people to get outside, our children in our neighborhood flock to these protected woods in joyful abandonment, racing its trails and finding memories that will last a lifetime. We stand before you as concerned community members. Community. Community environment are words that we often hear politicians toss around at election time, but it is that sense of community and environment that brings us here today. Community is what we cherish, it's what we long to find. Your house is your house, but your home is a community. Our community is forged and walks through our woods. I might not remember all of my neighbors' names, but I certainly remember all of their dogs. We know every turn in the woods, and we know the squeal of the laughter as a child that runs through those woods. We are a community that relish in the bird song, a song that is occasionally interrupted by the laughter of children. Yet despite this beautiful and unique environment, we are here to address the potential threat to these protected lands. Kitchener is at a crossroads. Hold the Line Waterloo region notes that the industrial areas of our city could be redeveloped and expand without affecting the urban boundary. Yet we continue to spread future development out as opposed to up. Six Nations Chief Mark Hill has said it would not be responsible to allow continued development in this uncertain legal environment. Yet we continue to build suburbs. We know that the reality is, we know that development is going to happen. We understand that's an important thing for the council to consider. However, we're asking you to wait. We're asking you to be smart. We are asking you to defer the Bean Road extension until Robert Ferry has been extended to Strasbourg. It is only then that we can have real up-to-date traffic studies and one that better reflects our new reality. This is one of those moments of truth that you, Mr. Mayor, spoke about at your State of the City address. This will affect the wildlife, the citizens, and as you just heard from Mike, the children of our community. I teach civics by day. And there's a cynicism in young people that you guys saw in the last election results and the numbers that vote for the very seats that you're sitting in. It has given rise to populist movements that echo the belief that politicians don't care about us. Something we see constantly in our Facebook group. We believe this will pass because, quote unquote, politicians don't care. I teach civics, and as I just said, and I try and teach them every single year that this isn't the case. And in some, there's a glimmer of hope. There's a hope that civic engagement in politics can do what's right for a community and for the environment. And I stand before you today believing that. I firmly believe that civic engagement in politics can do what is right for the environment and for a community. And I'm hopeful today that you will listen. I don't want you to listen only for me and my fellow community members. I want you to listen for the future stewards of our society. I want you to defer this extension for the young people who wonder if politicians really do listen. These young people are watching to see what will come of the forests and wetlands that they call home. This is their community. This is their home. These are their streets. These are their woods. This is their hood. So listen for them. I ask today that you listen and you put aside your preconceived beliefs and opinions and ask you to imagine that Brigadoon, this little part of Kitchener named after a mysterious Scottish village that appears for only one day every 100 years, is your community. It is where your children live, it is where your children laugh, and it is where your children grow. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. O'Connor. And Mr. John Van Donk is next, please. Welcome, Mr. Van Donk.
Good afternoon, Chair Johnson, Mayor, and Councilors. My name is John Van Donk, and I was speaking to you today about the provincially significant Wetlands 30, which is located at the end of Bean Drive, where the city is proposing to extend Bean Drive and the sanitary trunk sewer to the future Robert Ferry Drive extension. During the 2022 municipal election campaign, I was contacted by several concerned citizens who lived in the surrounding areas of the proposed Bean Drive extension. They invited me to tour the provincially significant Wetlands 30, the Brigadoon Woods, and the Strasbourg Creek watershed. The tour took place on a cold, damp day, and I was pleasantly surprised to see the number of families that were walking the trails of Brigadoon Woods. In the spring, I hope all of you will take the opportunity to walk these trails so that you may understand why these citizens are so passionate about saving these wetlands, woods, and watersheds. During this tour, we discussed their legitimate concerns about the destruction of these significant wetlands, the trout habitat, which we've already heard about from Mr. Mike Funk, and the possible destruction of the surrounding woodlands if the Bean Drive extension project proceeds. These citizens also discussed with me their solutions to address theirs and the city's concerns about the street extension not going forward and allowing for the extension of city services to the proposed new neighborhoods along the Robert Ferry Drive future extension. You will hear their solutions following me from Mr. Frank Moffett. After this tour, I went online to review numerous reports, studies concerning this and other relevant projects in the area to familiarize myself with the issues. While canvassing during the campaign in the areas surrounding the provincially significant wetlands 30 and the Brigadoon Woods, I did not hear from one citizen who supported the Bean Drive extension. Chair, Mayor, and Councillors, you should have before you a copy of a newspaper article which appeared in the Waterloo Region Record on February 3rd of this year. This is the reason I felt it was very important to speak with you today. Now is the time to protect these wetlands. University of Waterloo researchers say small wetlands play a major role in water conservation. Researchers from the University of Waterloo have documented the importance of small wetlands play in the water purification and conservation. Environmental research letters show how small wetlands trap large amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other contaminants, protecting nearby rivers and lakes from the pollutants. Reports of beach closures, algae blooms, and degraded drinking water are on the rise as the population expands in southern Ontario. As we increase our population, we're going to have more pollution, and as we take away these wetlands, which are filters on the landscape, it is going to increase our algae blooms and beach closures. Larger wetlands are not as effective as filters because much of the pollution gets washed downstream. These smaller wetlands turn out to be more efficient in terms of retaining the pollutants. The demand for growing population, the demand for more housing increases with a growing population, and the small wetlands are currently left unprotected. As we are increasing those pressures, there's more pollution that is going to come into play. So now is the time to protect these wetlands, even more than before. The destruction of wetlands also increases our vulnerability to the extreme effects of climate change, including flooding, drought, and frequency of storms. This research is so relevant to the provincially significant Wetlands 30, as this wetland is a small wetland in our community. In closing, I ask all of you to, at the very least, defer the Bean Drive extension until after the Robert Ferry extension to Strasbourg Road is complete. Thank you. Subject to any questions, I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Van Donk. Next, we have Mr. Frank Moffett, please. Welcome, Mr. Moffett.
Bean Drive, water and sewer connections. Is building a road the only option? Next, please. I am a 30-year resident of this area, and thank you to this committee for letting us speak. We know that...
Mr. Moffett, I'm sorry, could you please move the one microphone a little bit closer to you? There? That one, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I am a 30-year resident of this area and a member of the working group. Thank you to this committee for letting us speak. We know that development is going to happen. Our city is growing. We also know that our citizens, current and future, need access to safe roads, resilient neighborhoods that prevent floods, and clean water and sanitation. Next, please. We've heard today that based on actual traffic numbers, we can have safe roads without extending Bean Drive. We've heard today that based on environmental data, small wetlands such as PSW 30 are essential to creating resilient neighborhoods. The only question is, for the new developments, can we have clean water and sanitation without disrupting PSW 30? Next, please. Yes. Yes, we can. Next, please. Due to the high water table, many homes in our area would flood if it weren't for the constant use of sump pumps. Many insurers have refused to offer flood insurance to residents in the area. It is absolutely essential that any actions we take today protect current residents and those in future developments from water damage. This means protecting PSW 30. Approximately a decade ago, the city spent millions of dollars to restore Ward's Pond and redirect the stream. We must protect the environment that is now at risk due to the new construction being proposed in the area. Ministry of Natural Resources statement to the region of Waterloo. It is our opinion that there should be no diversion of either surface or groundwater from the swamp. The Strasburg Creek wetland is a discharge wetland that acts as a source area for the Bean Drive tributary of Strasburg Creek. We believe development should not impact on the base flow to this stream because it contains critical spawning and cold water brook trout habitat. Next slide, please. The provincial government recognizes the value of small wetlands. They help protect our neighborhoods, absorbing water runoff from an area 70 times their size, significantly reducing flood risk in the short and long term. PSW 30 is more than a pleasant place to walk. It is a critical and irreplaceable piece of city infrastructure that plays an essential role in protecting our residents from floods. Next, please. The question before us is how to provide the necessary water and sanitary sewer infrastructure from the current terminus of Bean Drive to the new developments that will be served by the finished Robert Ferry Drive. Next, please. The proposed construction is trenching. Next slide, please. Next one. Okay. Trenching is ideal for most situations, however, not in a wetland. Next, please. Working in high water table, like the wetlands, there is a high risk of cave-ins. Trench boxes will be required. Builders will likely need a water-taking permit due to the volume of water being pumped, and any water being pumped must be treated before it is discharged back to the natural environment. This adds costs and will be highly disruptive to the environment, damaging the wetlands, harming wildlife, and reducing nature's ability to reduce flood risk. Next, please. Now, the approximate cost of trenching for the 200 meters through the PSW is $280,000. Please note that is under normal conditions, and that is not the case in this situation. Next, please. The proposal is directional or horizontal drilling. This is the ideal solution. Next, please. Directional drilling bypasses sensitive areas. There's no disruptive trenching. No water taking permits would be required. and modern sustainable infrastructure is still created. Next, please. Several companies have been contacted for ballpark estimates for directional drilling under the PSW, and that was $300,000. Next, please. So traditional trenching would be approximately $280,000. Directional drilling would be $300,000. Next, please. For a scant $20,000, we can build necessary infrastructure, protect the environment, strengthen neighborhood resilience, and preserve the investment the city made in the Woods Pond area. Next, please. The city's own engineering firm of choice who prepared the environmental assessment for this project is based on recommend trenchless or horizontal drilling for the sanitary sewer. That's in the EAPH 325.
Mr. Moffett, are you close to finishing?
Yep.
Thank you.
Two more. Next, please. The directional drilling is respectful of the environment and people living in the area. This is a direct quote from a local drilling firm. Next, please. The Ministry of Environment is very clear. Do not build in wetlands. We have a solution, directional drilling. This is a final pillar in our proposal to defer the extension of Bean Drive. Safe roads, resilient neighborhoods, sustainable infrastructure. Next, please. We can have it all. Safe roads, resilient neighborhoods, and sustainable infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moffett. Next, we have Ms. Susan Fallows, please.
Hello, I'm Susan Fallows. I've been a resident of Brigadoon for 34 years, and I'm just here on behalf of our video, which was made by Corey Ill, and it features your future constituents. So here we are at the end of Bean.
Thank you, Ms. Fallows. Thank you for the video. And next we have Mr. Greg Mikolenko, please. Welcome, Mr. Mikolenko.
Thank you. My name is Greg Mikolenko. I have a degree in biology. I taught environmental studies at the University of Waterloo, and I'm presently retired. I served on the Ecological and Environmental Advisory Committee of the Region of Waterloo for 10 years. That committee was set up to consider development proposals that affected designated high-quality natural areas, such as the one here. I was on EAC when the original proposal for the extensive residential developments around the Strasburg Creeks wetland was referred to it. I was appointed to the subcommittee assigned to the case. We made an extensive day-long site visit. It was a real joy to explore such an interesting, high-quality, complex site with some very fine natural areas, as well as agricultural fields and an indigenous burial ground. Furry developers had already, and in my opinion prematurely, pressured the city to agree on a major road crossing that would break up the wetland. That was disappointing. The developer's environmental studies also had weaknesses in it and was quite problematic. While I was on EAC, a residential development proposal for a problematic site in Urbsville next to the Cartway at the extreme northwest corner of the city of Waterloo was assigned to EAC. It includes a proposed gated community of 14 luxury homes in an agricultural field surrounded by swampy forest with problematic access. The developer, strangely enough, unlike the usual case where a natural area upon approval would be deeded to the city, wanted to keep that as part of the private gated community. EAC's terms of reference for the environmental assessment included studying an alternative to putting housing on it, to ecologically restore the field instead of building on it. The resulting environmental assessment completely ignored EAC's restoration alternative. The city of Waterloo came out thoroughly on the side of restoring that place. However, the developer, Mr. Britton, then took his case to the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal in 2021. I was no longer an EAC, but I was accepted as an individual having participant status. The hearing lasted 22 working days last fall at an estimated cost of $800,000 to $1 million to the city of Waterloo. Most of it concerned arguments about building a really strange elevated access road over the swampy area. A final decision is still pending. The superficial features of the wetland complex we're studying today are varied and largely in good shape. The hydrological features are likely also complicated, to some extent unknown and inherently difficult to assess. It's best to go as lightly as possible. At Portuguese Swamp in southeast Cambridge, 4 subdivisions in turn were developed beside the swamp, each well studied with state-of-the-art stormwater retention ponds. Unfortunately, a totally unexpected tipping point was reached with the 3rd or 4th subdivision, and the level of the groundwater rose and drowned a considerable area of the forest. It looks horrible and sad now. There's no going back. I think it is unwise to put a road through the end of Main Street. The threat of ponding is too great, and it could not be rectified. It might be possible to carefully insert some service connections, as has been so wisely stated here. It would be very difficult to prevent road salt from infiltrating the subsurface water. Please remember that Kitchener-Waterloo is the largest municipality in Canada, mostly dependent on groundwater for its domestic water supply. And it is also the 4th fastest growing urban area in Canada. The gradual rise in the saltiness of our groundwater in this area has started to raise concerns. The alternative would be a $3 billion pipeline to Lake Erie. I think that the brook trout have spoken very well. I would accept their wisdom. There was an article in the newspaper today that a bunch of developers were present at the Stag and Doe wedding reception for our premier's daughter, and they gave financial contributions. It's rather a perilous situation now for considering development proposals in this province. Be very careful, and please listen to those people that have made such good presentation. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mikolenko. Greg. Okay, and council, questions of staff and delegates and/or delegates? Mayor Barry Verbanovic.
Thanks, Chair Johnson, and thanks to all the delegations who came in this evening. A couple of questions of staff, if I may, Madam Chair. We've heard from numerous delegations this evening who are asking us to defer this until Robert Ferry gets through, so that we better understand the impact on traffic and potentially mitigate the implications on the wetland if in fact it doesn't become required. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and why we can't, in your opinion, potentially do that, or in fact, is it something that we could consider, and what are the implications of that?
Through the chair, we did look at it.
Hold on, the mic's not on.
Who's that? Oh, sorry. We did review, that was actually alternative 4. That was added to the study after the initial PIC. We heard from residents. We added that, expanded the study area to say, okay, if we don't extend the road, we just extend the services, what would the implications be? And you know, it scored a lot lower than the preferred alternative. Here, of course, there's a large transportation need as well. One of the other implications here is that Bean Drive is DC funded, where Robert Ferry Drive is developer built. So we would have to extend those services first, and then we could potentially see Robert Ferry Drive constructed. However, one's a north-south collector and the other's an east-west collector. So we didn't really look into it in detail after the initial scoring because it came out much lower because that transportation need is there. I'm not sure if, Steve, you want to add anything to that?
I was going to just describe, the EA gets environmental clearance for the project. You have lots of ability for phasing and staging works as council might direct, but there'll be technical studies that'll come after the EA that'll answer some of the questions that came out tonight by citizens. So really the EA clearance defines your ability to implement if and when you choose to do so. But as Eric described, there are some elements that have to go through. The transportation need is separate from the municipal servicing need. It's there, but the only comment I was going to describe, good presentations by the public. If you looked at the presentation that I gave, the location of the alignment was moved as far to the east as possible to be the edge of the wetland based on public input. The footprint of the roadway was minimized to compress it to be small as it could be based on theirs and First Nation and stakeholder input. So it's a balance. There is no perfect solution. There's going to be effects, and it's tried to find a balanced solution. And I do think there's other communities that have effects that came out as part of the EA. You've got traffic calming issues to the north. Other communities have effects. Deferring it to Robert Ferry is extended does let you look at future conditions, but that's my business. I forecast future traffic conditions, whether it's built or not. So we're pretty confident in what the traffic will be in the future. But again, it's council's decision when projects are implemented in phases. This step just gets you approval to do it if and when you choose to do it.
Thank
Just
you.
building on your
Mayor
further, on your comment that we have an idea of what traffic will be in the future, I'm wondering if you can further elaborate on that. I mean, are you assuming the traffic will be the same as it has been? Are you assuming that as time goes on, we'll in fact potentially see people moving to other modes of transportation? As you know, we're doing a lot to try to encourage cycling where that's possible. And we know in the fullness of time, technologies and so on will change traffic patterns.
Yep, they will, and we've seen it with the pandemic. It could allow you to take a look at those changes. We do promote transit. Bean Drive would be a good route for transit service to the community for those that don't want to take personal vehicles. But based on even having some changes for modes of travel, the core is expected to carry a load for the 4 communities that serve the bigger community. So it has benefits. It's benefits for the other 3 communities as opposed to this one, but there's a balancing of the needs. And the EA ended up in a point where it bundled 2 things in a quarter. If you're going to cross a quarter for the municipal services, it provided relief for traffic, as well as vehiculars, but pedestrians and cyclists and transit through that same spine.
Okay, I do have more questions, Madam Chair, but I'll cue in a second time, as I imagine there are others.
Thank you. Mr. Reedman wanted to comment as well.
Yeah, through the chair, I think there's a couple other points to highlight. And so Carindale right now is carrying higher traffic volumes than anticipated for that type of street, and there's an elementary school right along that street. As Mr. Reich said, the development charges are funding this, and so the sewer connection does need to go through to provide sewer and water access to the future community in that area. And we did look at whether we could phase the road construction through there to look at sort of that hybrid option 4. And what was understood from that is there's a throwaway cost of approximately $1 million if we have to go back through 2 separate contracts to install a road at a later date. There's also other risks that council should be aware of. So there's sediment runoff and erosion, sediment control, disturbance to wetland, renaturalization area requirements from even if we tunnel most of it, there is portions where we have to put in cleanouts and access roads for maintenance vehicles to access the infrastructure that's placed under that roadway. We would have to wait 2 years between the 2 contracts at a minimum to make sure we don't void the warranty on the first phase of work versus the second phase. Regulatory permitting agencies may require conditions during both phase 1 and phase 2, and we would be restricted on the amount of tree planting that we'd be able to put in after the fact based on the possibility of having to go back to put a road on top of that corridor after, and we might actually impact the base of the granular through erosion, sedimentation, and materials building up in that location, and so there's other impacts that we may not foresee based on delaying the project over at least a 2-year cycle.
Thank you, Mr. Reedman. Councillor Singh.
Thank you, Chair Johnston, and like Mayor Beveridge, I just want to quickly take a moment and thank all the delegates. I think the points put across were well researched on your part for the delegates, as well as well thought out rationale in providing, of course, the opposition for the extension. So my question was similar to Mayor Beveridge, but I'll kind of go into it a little bit deeper. So perhaps Mr. Reedman can, or from the engineering perspective. So my understanding, later part of what Mr. Reedman that you said was that phased approach may not be obviously advisable, again related to cost and considerable perhaps environmental impacts as well. Redisturbing a sensitive area may not be advisable. So I agree with you. I think it's either do or not. So in that consideration, I understand that the infrastructure extension is necessary for the development that's built into our official plan in that area for further extension of those communities. Could we not just have a stormwater and sewer water infrastructure extension, but not necessarily a roadway? If the rationale, perhaps because of the changing needs for vehicular traffic in that neighborhood may change in future years, like what Mayor Rabinovich has said. Is that a consideration? Could we do one and not the other?
Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, and so that was alternative 4. It did consider that. However, there are maintenance access requirements and other things through that corridor to make sure that we can access the sanitary sewer and the water mains to make sure they're maintained properly. And so there will still be an impact whether there's a road there or not. And it also does cut off traffic flow for a significant portion of the future community accessing the school and other locations, as well as redistributing traffic through the neighborhood. And so that alternative was considered through alternative 4, and it was deemed not to be as preferred in the overall context of the environmental assessment.
And so again, just to push a little further, the traffic requirements aside, access, of course, I understand that. That fourth alternative, did it consider a trail network, so which would still provide like a multi-use trail network that's wider, that could still provide access, but at the same time, it's not vehicular traffic?
Yeah, through the chair, so it did consider a trail connection through there, and it still scored lower on the environmental assessment. I do want to also point out that the current cul-de-sac at Bean Drive is almost 100 meters longer than our fire access permits, and so our fire policy requires a secondary access for any cul-de-sac that's longer than 150 meters, and it's about 250 meters from the closest intersection to the end of Bean Drive, and so there is an ongoing issue with fire response in that portion of Bean Drive.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Just for my own interest, why does a provincially significant wetland designation get made?
So it's based on ecological functions within the area, and it gets a rating system. The larger the contiguous area of the wetland, the higher the potential it can be rated as a PSW. So keeping the larger block of the wetland together is desirable.
Okay. I heard from a number of the delegations that sump pumps are in high use and they can't get insurance for flood. I just want to know what this work would do for groundwater displacement, and could this make these issues worse for the current homeowners in the area?
It would be, through the chair, it would be part of the next step of the work would be including geotechnical investigations. The expectation is it would try to define the current level of water in the area of construction, and it would try to limit any groundwater lowering for either the municipal services or the road. So it would likely end up being a little bit higher, and that was thought to be a means that we could include the wildlife crossing being at a higher elevation. It could go under the road. So the effect for lowering the groundwater is expected to be small, but it's still to be assessed with additional geotechnical investigation that would follow the EA.
Okay. And if it shows that this, if the research study shows it could be an issue, then what would happen?
That would be part of the geotechnical recommendations for what changes or mitigation measures would have to be made as part of the design of the municipal services and or the road.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Schneider. Councillor Deneau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a few questions, and so I'm just going to piggyback on that question that Councillor Schneider has asked. So what I'm understanding is all of the studies haven't really necessarily been done yet in regards to flooding in the area. So is that what I'm understanding?
So the EA has identified next steps, so there's more comprehensive studies that are undertaken. So there's been environmental work done. It's recommended that there be additional environmental studies done for vegetation that is right within the corridor at the time of the advance of construction, as well as geotechnical investigations. We have limited at the beginning of the EA, but it would be greater detail undertaken at the next step.
Okay, so obviously I'm really new to this process. So is that, it must be standard that we approve certain projects and then we find out potential issues afterwards? That's what I'm gathering from this. Is that normal?
It's standard across the province. It's taken to a preliminary design stage at this step, and the detailed design stage actually works out details or defines mitigation measures that were identified at this stage to be hammered out.
So we're reactive as opposed to being proactive. So I don't know if you may have answered Councillor Schneider's question. Will there be an increase for floods in that area?
I don't think so. Based on the profile that we set, it's elevated, so it's not expected to be changing, lowering groundwater elevations.
Okay. Robert Ferry extension, is there a timeline on when that's going to go through? Is that the 2-year that was discussed? Does anybody know?
So Robert Ferry, there's 2 plans of subdivision, Holman and Sunvest Reed, and Bean Drive is essentially, this EA was holding up the draft plan approval. So Robert Ferry Drive does fall within those subdivisions. Essentially this EA needs to be finalized, and then, you could see those 2 roads being built. Right now, a developer has no outlet, so there's no really, there'd be no need to build Robert Ferry Drive right now. That would be a lot of out-of-pocket cost without being able to build homes.
Okay. I noticed on one of the slides, there was alternative 1 and 2, and then there was alternative 4. What happened to 3? Was there an alternative 3 that wasn't looked at, or was left off?
It was one that had a greater environmental impact. It was farther to the west,
okay,
and we screened it and didn't carry it forward.
Okay. And so, a couple minutes left. PSWs, they're protected, right? And you can't develop on provincially significant wetlands, but you can build new infrastructure on it.
Yes. There's an exemption for municipal infrastructure and transmission corridors. But yes, it prohibits development. But development has a definition that, if you read it, it excludes the uses for municipal services.
Okay. I know you didn't write the language, but it seems to me very loosey-goosey. Infrastructure is development, development is infrastructure. And so you said there was no species at risk within the wetland? Is that, I heard that earlier, there was no species at risk that were found in the wetland? And the brook trout, there's not an endangered species? I don't know.
So the fisheries investigations had identified that the fisheries resources were much farther to the west, the watercourse that was shown. It's a valuable watercourse, but this is at a greater distance from it, and it's the residual effects were all related to vegetation.
Okay. Last question. I saw a couple on the slides talking about directional drilling. Has that something that the city has looked at? And if so, why is that not a viable option? And if not, why haven't we looked at that option? And I don't know anything about directional drilling. I just saw it mentioned a few times from the delegates.
It's been identified by our EA. It would be part of the next phase of the work to take a look at how much it could be included and how well it would be effective. But I think we've identified internally that there will still be elements of work that will need to be done within the wetland. There's technical issues with it with regard to uplift, if there's groundwater forces, and it should be on the table for consideration to minimize any effects in the wetland.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Deneau. Councillor Clancy.
Thank you. And I appreciate the delegations. Thank you so much. And I'm also appreciative of our regional official plan, and I'm hopeful it'll get ratified because it does prevent urban sprawl, which I think is going to be good for our wetlands going forward. When I looked at the report, you referred to consultations with Indigenous communities, but I didn't see their response. Can you share and maybe it was in there somewhere and I missed it, but can you share what the Indigenous community's feedback was?
So although we contacted several First Nations, the Six Nations were the ones that had the interest, and they've actually participated on the ground, boots on the ground review of the corridor. And their comments were protection of water quality and trying to provide mitigation for any trees or loss. They're asking for a multiple of whatever tree's taken for the replacement of it. But they have agreed to participate with the city in the next phase of the design. So they're looking for beneficial elements of the design. The change of the cul-de-sac at the northeast end can be reduced and potentially reinstated as PSWs, so as part of the plus minus of the effects of the project.
So they weren't against this?
They weren't against it.
This alternative being chosen?
No.
Okay. I also was curious because to me, alternative 4 seemed like the least intrusive to the environment, and then it wasn't ranked number 1 under, like, how is that?
Well, there's pluses and minuses. I didn't go into the evaluation process necessarily, but it had a smaller footprint in the PSW, but it still had a footprint for the municipal services, as well as the active transportation crossing from it. And then it had negative effects to the other community on Carringdale. And we did have comments from members of the public on the Carringdale community that recognize that there more traffic that would be using their corridor would be a disadvantage to their community. So we had pluses and minuses for them, but on balance, bundling the corridors in a single one, if we were going to touch the corridor across the wetland, where we ended up was trying to minimize the footprint of the road corridor that was sitting on top of the utility corridor, and it came out as the preferred option.
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't, yeah, it seemed like with some of the weighting, transportation seemed to be a priority. I wondered if there was a consideration to reduce the width further by having just the multi-use trail and not the sidewalk. Was that a consideration made?
Yeah, through the chair, sorry. We explored options as much as possible for reducing the footprint of the road through the wetland. Unfortunately, just due to the bend of the road, if we went with one side, like a multi-use trail on the south side, and nothing on the north, the problem is you end up with multiple pedestrian crossings then. So you have a bend in a road and pedestrian crossings at both ends. It's not ideal. Generally speaking, you know, we are complete streets. We try to provide at least a sidewalk on either side. In this case, instead of the new standard would be 26-meter right-of-way with 3-meter multi-use trails on both sides. We've reduced the boulevards down to as small as operations can permit with snow storage. And we've left, instead of 1.8-meter sidewalk, we went with 1.5 on the north side and the 3-meter multi-use trail on the south side. So we did look at reducing even further, but it's just there's a lot of stakeholders, and you know, trying to get people safely through this was a big priority. We didn't feel that the additional crossings you know, were warranted or safe.
Mr. Reedman wants to comment as well.
Yeah, through the chair. And so the city does have a sidewalk infill policy, and so it does require sidewalks on both sides of streets. Given that this is a major neighborhood collector street, it is foreseeable that transit would run along this alignment in the future, and so having a sidewalk on one side would impact transit use as well in the community.
Thank you. I have one more question. It seems like we've built around a lot of wetland. What steps, and maybe this is more for staff, how can we prevent this kind of encroachment on wetland down the road? I know that we're waiting for our official plan, and maybe that, and maybe you can refer me to the proper documentation, but how can we prevent this kind of battle between nature and development going forward. I don't know if...
Mr. Reedman?
Yeah, through the chair. So the official plan does consider our natural environment and our natural systems and considers development that balances that as well. In certain circumstances where there is infrastructure that needs to go near or through a corridor, there's the environmental assessment process that we look at to make sure we're minimizing the impact and looking at any ways to mitigate adverse effects on those. And so, we follow provincial guidelines and make sure that we're following all of the directives for our local official plan as well as provincial policies whenever we're weighing these decisions, but we want to make sure that we have a high-quality functioning environment as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Owadani.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. When we eventually build this road connecting to Strasbourg, my question is around, it snows outside, we pour salt on the road. Over a period of time, how will that affect the streams and the pond area as well?
Most of the road portion is going to be diverted to the stormwater management pond that's located on the south side. The remainder, the 200 meters that goes through the PSW, will flow to the north. There's existing drainage today that comes from Bean Drive that ends up at that point. The recommendations in the ESR is that we'd have stormwater treatment at that location that would pick up the 200 meters that's coming from the south, as well as picking up the stuff that today is coming from the north. So
are we suggesting that the salt that will be poured on the road will not affect the groundwater?
It is going to go through a treatment before being released.
So it will affect it eventually?
It will go through, be treated, and then it'll be surface water.
Okay.
Primarily through the stormwater management pond that's being built on the south side of the wetland.
Okay.
Mr. Reedman wanted to comment on that as well.
Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Reedman.
Yeah, through the chair, and so it's not possible to fully treat road salt, so what we're looking to do is direct it to the stormwater pond to try to manage, to minimize infiltration into the groundwater. Through detailed design as well, we'd be looking at maintaining boulevard space so that we'd have the sidewalk and the multi-use trail draining towards the boulevard and into the storm sewer connection there as well, rather than draining out off to the wetland area.
Okay. While looking through the document, sorry, another question. I see here, page 19 of what I have, it says 10-to-1 tree replacement, 1-to-1 wetland replacement, and 2-to-1 wetland replacement. If you can just speak to what that means, really appreciate it.
That was a request from the Six Nations to be the bar that they'd like us to achieve. So during the next phase, the detailed design, those would be the objectives to try to achieve.
Oh, that's the goal of what, is it for every 10 cut down replaced by 1, or for every 1 cut down?
Every tree cut down to replace it with 10.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just going back to my questions. What were the key concerns from fire service? I know, I think Mayor Barry had alluded to that. Would just love us to expand on that a bit.
It's for all the emergency services, the desire is to have multiple accesses into the communities. So providing the linkage is a good thing from an emergency services perspective, fire, ambulance, and police.
And they're saying this, not having this access is a hindrance for their service? It slows down the service?
Through the chair, and so any cul-de-sac or road that's longer than 150 meters under our current development standards requires a secondary access, and so sometimes it's a gated access that provides access if that road is blocked. So if there's some sort of disaster that's limiting access to those households, having a secondary access is critical for ensuring a rapid response time. And so right now we know that area of Bean Drive is currently under-serviced and does not meet our current standard. at 250 meters approximately from the closest, so the only access point is 250 meters away from the furthest household.
Okay. Madam Chair, we have questions for previous delegates. Do we come back, queue in again?
Yes, you can
Okay.
key back in.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you. Most of my questions have been asked, but I wanted to ask, the city spent $2 million 10 years ago on what and why, what's changed now? Like, why would that not still be something you would want to protect?
Through the chair, my apologies, I was not involved in Ward's Pond. I'm not really sure. I think that was the project that you were referring to, but there's a stormwater utility, and that's separate from engineering. So that's not a project that engineering was involved in.
So I don't, Mr. Reedman, do you have any more information on that?
Through the chair, so that is something we report back to council before the final decision is made on this. It was before my time at the city, and so I'd have to look into what the details are on that, just to understand more.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll leave it at that right now. I'll make comments later.
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. You're doing a great job. I guess one of my questions would be with regards to the traffic, and when I'm looking at the report here, if I understand this correctly, if we don't do the extension, then we'll be seeing an increase of traffic in the area by 1,000 cars at least?
So, yeah, there's about 2,500 trips a day that comes out of Bean Drive, so it either is going to go to different communities, or if it will be removed from other communities if it's allowed to go south on the extension.
Okay. I want to touch upon a little bit about the salt too, because wouldn't our current streets right now that we're using salt, wouldn't that salt be penetrating into the water right now because we don't have anything right now doing anything, right?
Through the chair, yes. You can't remove salt from water.
Okay. I guess my last question, and this may be a bit of a legal issue, but I'm not sure if it does, so then I don't care to get the answer today. But what's our obligation with this project to commit to?
Yeah, through the chair, and so if this project were to be turned down, we would have no servicing for that portion of the community, which would ultimately stop new development, and we also know that we have a housing crisis in our community, as well as obligations around climate change, and 49% of our greenhouse gas emissions in our community is from transportation as well, and so the more we're requiring people to drive, we're not tackling the emissions from transportation.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Davey?
Yes, thank you, and that actually leads into the question that I had. So do we have an idea of, well, first of all, can you confirm if the road doesn't go through, will it affect the potential homes that could be built in that area? Like, will it harm either the number or the delay?
Through the chair, perhaps Mr. Britton could respond to that. I know he's representing landholders in the area, and he may have more context that he could speak to.
Okay, and are we coming back to questions of former delegates?
Yes.
Okay. And I guess, okay, so just as a preface then, the same question, another follow-up question I might ask, and I'm not sure if staff would reply, but according to the planning, and maybe they'll have to come back with this for council, I'm wondering the total number of homes that this area represents that would be in question. Actually, one last question of the, I guess, the consultant. From the original proposal, alternative 3, which is no longer the recommendation, do you know offhand the length, in terms of whether it's alternative 1 or alternative 2, the length, the difference of the length of the wetland that would be affected?
I'm just estimating, I think it was about 50% more wetland removed than the ones we ended up with.
So from the original proposal, we have cut through by 50%. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. And for second round, Mayor Urbanovic.
Thanks very much. I have a number of questions still. Some have been asked. On the fire piece with respect to Bean Drive and the extra 100 meters, do we know how many homes that's affecting? I guess probably Mr. Reedman or someone from staff?
Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, if you give me a few minutes, I just have to go back to look at Google Maps just to see how many the total count will be. So I wouldn't have an answer right now, but I can get that very shortly.
But notwithstanding, I guess the second part of my question, notwithstanding the fact that these are existing homes, so we don't have the same mechanisms as we did in other areas that weren't developed yet, it would seem to me that direct detect is a very effective and simple way of trying to deal with that if there is if there's an issue around response times potentially there. So that's something that I'd like to see looked at. Secondly, in terms of Carindale Drive, I mean, I've been on Carindale Drive to see what the traffic looks like. And really some of the significant issues are only happening a few times a day, and that's as students are arriving and leaving school. Is that not in fact a fact?
So the busiest times of the day are the morning peak hours and the afternoon peak hours. So the busiest that conflict with the school is the morning. So that's the busiest time period with children and vehicles.
So 20 to 30 minutes a day, roughly, as people are dropping kids off?
Yeah, in that hour, yeah.
Okay. And is it fair to say that there's many other streets in existing neighborhoods around the city where that may in fact be the case as well, that were developed at a time when kids were walking to school and not being driven and so on, and so we're seeing those same peaks elsewhere, and we're having to manage them, not unlike the situation on Carindale.
Most streets that have schools aren't designed for major collectors. They're on minor collectors or less to try to avoid areas of higher traffic. And the fact that there's traffic calming on Carindale and traffic calming being considered on Bean Drive is indicative of residents that live in other areas having perspectives of safety.
Yep.
Mr. Reedman, did you want to comment on that too?
Through the chair, I just wanted to speak to the direct detect comment. So it isn't actually about response times, it's about access and distance from a point. And so getting a vehicle, so if there's a vehicular collision or something that's blocking access, it's actually the distance to those neighborhoods. So if there's, say, an explosion in a neighborhood and there's debris and other things, that the 150 meters is to allow that the vehicles can access or people can access to respond to that emergency. It's not related to a service response time.
Okay, but that exists already today, correct? Those issues?
Through the chair, yes, that's correct. It does it does exist today. However, the network for the streets was always envisioned to expand through, so that this wouldn't be an ongoing issue.
Okay. I am a little concerned. I will say that it seems the Ward Pond issue that was raised doesn't seem, notwithstanding the fact that it is a stormwater management utility, the fact that it doesn't seem to have factored into all this in a significant way up till now causes me a little bit of concern, so I'll flag that.
But the last point I want to touch on, recognizing that I'm running out of time, is your comment, Mr. Reedman, with respect to the housing crisis and development of lands. Is it not true that servicing could in fact happen with directional drilling or another option without the road necessarily going through? And so therefore the housing construction wouldn't be jeopardized?
Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, so there's still impacts to that corridor, so we would need maintenance access, there's manhole spacing for cleanouts and other things, so there would be significant impacts to the corridor. If we were to go back and look at putting a road in later based on, the concern that was raised tonight by delegations of waiting and seeing what the traffic impacts look, we have modeled the traffic, and so we have a general understanding of what it would look like, but it would also add additional cost and complexity and risk to going back and adding a road at a later date. And so that would be the factor that council needs to consider is, we're looking at about $1 million in extra cost to go back, plus additional risk from erosion and the quality of the granule that's put in and left to sit there for at least 2 years until the warranty expires on the underground infrastructure that's placed.
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about the 2 years. How many units are we talking about that this will potentially serve?
Through the chair, the sanitary catchment area for Bean Drive trunk sewer, I believe, is around 6,000 persons.
6,000, how many homes?
How many homes?
Roughly.
Not sure about half that.
3,000?
3,000?
Okay,
Through the
thank
chair.
you. I've run out of time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I can't remember if Councillor Chapman went first or Councillor Owodani. Okay. Councillor Chapman.
Thank you. So I'm not familiar with the topography in this area, but I was wondering, we've got on page 2 of I guess this is the environmental assessment, we've got a map with the broader study area and then the local study area. What defined that broader study area? Like, why couldn't it be bigger, and why couldn't we be thinking about bringing in the services from some other direction? Why does it have to go through the wetlands?
That figure showed the study area was the footprint of where physical work might occur. The broader study area was defined in response to the community concerns of traffic, so it's the area of traffic trip generation. The sewer area is actually much farther to the south for the 3,000 houses that are going to be generating sewage for the sanitary sewer that's going to lead to Bean Drive. And it's dictated by the topography for gravity flow to this, from that development area to come to this point.
And the only possible connection is Bean Drive, but that connection doesn't exist right now, is that correct?
It's been planned.
It's planned, but it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist.
Okay.
It's been planned for, and the capacity is there on the other side of existing Bean Drive, but the connection hasn't been made.
Okay, so if we make a big circle around the area, is there any other connection that could be used to tap into rather than Bean Drive?
No.
Like nowhere in that whole, I don't know what this area is called, dune or whatever. There's not one single other source that we could be using.
Through the chair, generally speaking, sanitary trunk sewers follow the lowest elevation, so you would have a drainage sort of divide, and everything in a land area that drains to the low point, that's where you want to put your trunk sewer. We have a 525 millimeter trunk sewer at the end of Bean Drive currently, that really, if it isn't extended, a potential option could be an additional pumping station. Like, you can pump, but you can't really create new low points. So the alternative to not extending the sewer would be a new and unnecessary pumping station and force mains through existing streets. to get that sewage to, at some point on Bean Drive.
So, but if I look at this map, and again, I'm not all that familiar with the area, but if I look at Huron Road, there's a subdivision in that area, Huron Road and Strasburg Road, right? So they must tap into something.
Through the chair, Huron and Strasburg drains to generally the middle Strasburg trunk sewer, so it's a different trunk sewer network. Bean eventually does flow into that same network to the treatment plant, but they're sort of different trunk sewer alignments that follow low points through the city.
And there's no way we could consider tapping into that trunk line rather than going through this wetland?
Through the chair, no. Like not that would be economically feasible or even good for the environment.
Okay, because it seems to me that what we're focusing on mostly, and maybe I'll save my comments, but it seems traffic and money, but we're forgetting the big problem here, I think. Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. Councillor Owodani?
Hello? Okay, there we go. Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is two questions for two different delegates.
Do you remember their names?
Yes, Madam Jennifer Arruda and Mr. Greg. I apologize, I didn't catch your last name. So I will start with Jennifer Arruda.
Ms. Arruda, do you want to come back up to the mic, please? Thank you.
So during your presentation, you had shared some data with us around traffic around that area. Just interested in learning more about how you were able to gather that data.
That data is from, I can't remember his name, from the traffic calming studies that were performed on Bean Drive recently. Okay. Traffic calming studies that were performed on Carindale and the traffic calming that has already been constructed on Carindale. They haven't done post-traffic calming studies on Carindale yet. So the data that they collect is similar in comparison to the road classifications for annual average daily trips.
Okay.
And the other information from Robert Ferry was a 2019 traffic calming study, and Templewood and Marl Meadow came from the Robert Ferry EA back in 2013.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. And for Mr. Gregg, you had alluded to a $3 million pipeline during your presentation, I guess from the work that you did as a committee member. Could you just expand on that? I didn't really
$3 billion.
Billion, excuse me. Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah. This has to do with planning for provision of water to the region. About 30 years ago, they had forecasts based on per capita consumption and that from industry and so on, and that maintaining that. They forecast with population growth in about 20 years' time, they would have to build a pipeline to Lake Erie to bring in the water. Instead, the region and the municipalities wisely put in a program of conservation measures, replacing toilets with low flush ones, and you get $100 back from the cost and so on. And that was amazingly successful. It reduced per capita consumption by 50%, so we're spared having to take on that massive expense of $2 to $3 billion. However, we've got the problem of road salt. And as I've heard in the past and a few years ago, Professor Emil Frind, who is a hydrologist, was very worried through his own research that the salt level in our groundwater is gradually increasing. And measures are being used to try and limit salt contamination. But every possible thing would have to be looked at to limit that perforation of the groundwater by the salt. And so this, what I feel is an unneeded and unjustified intrusion over a wetland, would bring more salt into it, as would various other inattentions across the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gregg. No further questions.
Thank you, Councillor Owadani. Councillor Singh.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just trying to clarify a little bit more on my earlier questions, more focusing on alternative 4. I can understand the rationale, of course, as put regarding the transportation demand management, but apart from that, regarding the growth perspective, and again, the question is, of course, limiting the development in this neighborhood that's within our official plan, and of course, in speaking to the rationale put forward regarding the housing scarcity. So in alternative 4, in the planning perspective, in the staff or the consulting report outlines that it doesn't address existing demand or background growth. So just out of clarity again, it was my understanding alternative 4 is potentially still having the Stewart Trunk extension through Bean Drive and potentially having servicing of that Stewart Trunk Drive through a multi-use trail, so there's still accessibility, but it doesn't have vehicular traffic. It doesn't have the increased environmental risks associated to some of the concerns put forward by the delegates. So why does the report say that it doesn't meet the growth perspective if we are still allowing for the sewer trunk to proceed? Development can still go ahead, but it doesn't necessarily trigger many of the other concerns outlined, apart from the vehicular issues.
So it was a small delta for the footprint we ended up with to go from what was required for the multi-use path and active transportation crossing and serviceability for the corridor. That was going to be a corridor for municipal services. The delta was small enough that the benefits of not having additional traffic going to the Carringdale community rated it to be higher than the alternative 4 corridor.
No, I appreciate that, and I get why it's still not the preferred recommendation because of the increased demand and impacts to surrounding neighborhoods for the transportation consideration. But in the report, it outlines in the planning alternatives, so I'm focusing on the planning. Maybe I'm just not reading it properly though, but it says that alternative 4 doesn't meet the background and future growth. And I'm guessing the future growth is related to development. So I'm clarifying that on a planning perspective, on a development perspective, having the sewer trunk to proceed, but only through a multi-use trail, does that impede or slow down or perhaps, cause any risk to the development perspectives in the surrounding communities?
So the EA will define a road corridor even through the development lands to the south of the PSW, and developers need the certainty of where that corridor is going to be. So the road corridor has to be defined at least to the wetland for the development areas to proceed with plans of subdivision. It's a constraint for them.
But if you're proceeding through the sewer trunk, then you have servicing. So any available lands that are developable after the appropriate EAs, they wouldn't be impeded then.
They need to know where the right-of-way is going to be.
So we could outline that right away through the public corridor, public access corridor, which would be the multi-use trail potentially, if it was the alternative 4.
That was alternative 4, defining the road corridor all the way up to the edge of the wetland for the developer, and then having it a municipal servicing corridor through the wetland, a right-of-way, including active transportation and accessibility for maintenance vehicles that go through that section of the wetland. That was alternative 4.
Meaning having the sewer trunk extension but without the road itself.
Correct. That was alternative 4.
Right.
Thank you, Councillor Singh. I see no one else in the queue for questions. Do you want to key in for comments? Oh, sorry, Mayor Verbanovic.
Yeah, thank you. I think Councillor Davey was referred a question to Mr. Britton, and I'd be interested in that answer as well. So maybe Mr. Britton can come forward.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Britton. Just the question was if the Okay. I guess if the subsurface infrastructure goes through without the road, does that impact the timeline of potential development was the one question. The second question was, do you have an idea of the number of homes that this could potentially impede or affect?
Certainly, I would answer it this way. As a minimum, the sewer and the water main need to be extended within the corridor to get to the lands to the south, because without the sewer and the water main, it's technically difficult, if not impossible, to find another sanitary sewer outlet, other than perhaps a very expensive pumping station option, which would be an ongoing cost of the municipality to maintain, and likely retrofitting of existing streets to build force mains. So from a technical and cost perspective, that would be very difficult indeed. In terms of the road not extending through, I would suggest that you may be solving a problem, but creating a few other problems. Transit would not be extended down Bean Drive. And when you look at your official plan, there is a lot of policy that speak to encouraging transit and building transit-supportive community. And I would echo the comments of Mr. Reedman and your consultant that we too have evaluated extending only the services and a community trail and maintenance access for the services. The term was delta. I would say that the incremental difference in terms of impact is relatively insignificant. And then from a chloride perspective, although you might be saving the road length through the environmental feature, we have to also evaluated alternatives without Bean Drive, and the total road length would increase. Traffic would be diverted to the south, and there would be the need for additional road construction through the hydro corridor, which is fairly inefficient, but also in terms of the additional road length would result in additional chloride applications. So I think on balance, in terms of net impact, from a chloride perspective, there really are very little gains at all. And then from a development yield point of view, the Bean Drive trunk sewer and water main service not only the Brigadoon South community, but lands to the south and west of Strasburg Road, which have now been created as a result of the conveyance of lands for Strasburg Road. So I would suggest that Mr. Wright's estimate of about 3,000 units is accurate, but at a more micro level, without the road extension and having done considerable design work for the Hallman and some Best Reed lands, there would be a fairly significant impact on a number of multiple residential sites that are proposed. That when we're debating, you'll recall the region's land budget and the missing middle and the desire for that form of housing, a couple of those sites would be decimated as a result of the need to divert roads back across and then south to Robert Ferry Drive. And the net effect of all of this is, of course, it's important to connect the environment, but it's also important to connect community. And without that road extension, services would not be connected, and the communities would be disconnected, save and except for pedestrian access, which I noted would have, maybe only a smaller impact, but it would be somewhat negligible. So I hope that answered the question, and I would be pleased to quantify the impact in terms of units, and if it's helpful at all between now and council. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Britton.
Thank
Other
you.
questions? Okay. Mayor Verbanovic, another question?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Britton, and so I would be interested in more of that detail between now and council. But if I heard you correctly,
you could proceed with the homes, but obviously, in your professional opinion, there would be some other impacts that we should consider as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And then I guess the second part of it, of my question is, because you're representing the landowners, how would that impact the proceeding of Robert Ferry Drive in terms of
Yes.
your folks?
Well, certainly the Robert Ferry Drive has been delayed since 1989, pending the construction of Bean Drive. And, I would suggest that it's not just east-west connectivity, but it's also north-south. That is important. And as you know, I go back a long time. So the collector road network was planned at the same time as the scenic road network. So you've got a series of roads, Grove South being one of them, Tilt Drive being another one of them, and to a lesser extent, Rydell Drive, and portions of Carindale that run north and south. And all those roads are intended to be closed as community trails or have the potential to be closed. So that north-south connectivity and capacity will be significantly impacted. And that's where, although the focus is on the development to the south, I would submit that there's considerable development that has yet to occur in Dune South that will ultimately find its way along Robert Ferry Drive and up to Carindale as a desired route. And that, by not extending Bean Drive, I would suggest you're transferring a traffic problem from Bean Drive, which was never intended to be a cul-de-sac, to Carindale and other streets, including Robert Ferry Drive, which one of the delegates referenced it as an arterial route. That's how it was originally planned, to accommodate a huge volume of traffic. It's now a front-loaded collector road, so that road, in my submission, will be overloaded in time and significantly impacting that portion of the Dune South community. So there will be impacts, definitely.
But I guess specifically, would Robert Ferry Drive get built if Bean Drive is deferred? I mean, what we're hearing from a lot of the delegations is defer Bean Drive until Robert Ferry is built and you see the impacts of it. And I get, that one's east-west and the other isn't. But would Robert Ferry get built if that's the approach that we take on this?
I can't answer that on behalf of the client. What I can say is the feasibility of building Robert Ferry Drive from the developer's perspective would be considerably less because the unit yield would also be less. And the intention, it's a complicated question because there's two property owners and each property owner needs to proceed together. And there's a ripple effect in terms of how do you design lanes to the south if Bean Drive, at least in terms of its potential crossing, is not known. So as a minimum, that potential crossing location would need to be confirmed, and the road alignment through the Sunbest Reed and Holman lands would also need to be confirmed for me to do the design work necessary for Robert Ferry Drive to be extended. So it is a complicated question, and I can't answer today whether there would be a strong desire to proceed immediately with Robert Ferry Drive. Certainly not in the short term, because we would have to go back to the drawing boards in terms of all the work that's been done.
Is that something you could get some additional information for us?
Yes, certainly. Yeah,
Okay,
certainly.
Great, thank you. And then if I can just quickly, thank you, that's all.
Okay, thanks so much.
For you, and then just last first for staff, very quickly, for the benefit of everyone on council, can you just remind us, if council says no to, says they want to defer this, is there an appeal mechanism? What's the appeal mechanism? And if council says yes, I believe the appeal mechanism is a request to the minister for a bump up on the EA. But I'm wondering if you can just confirm both scenarios for council, a positive or a a negative recommendation.
Through the chair, at this point, we're waiting for council direction on the next steps of the EA process. Obviously, there is a number of options. As council, we can have the decision to defer or to have the decision today. We are waiting for direction for the next step, which is filing the report, the ESR, to the ministry. So until that is determined, the council endorses our EA, then we will proceed with the next step, which is filing the report for 30 days. So going back to the question, if the answer is no today, so that means that the report won't be filed with the ministry.
Well, no, but to be clear, the report won't be filed until after the 27th anyway. I guess my question is, if council decides to defer the road until Robert Ferry is built, and that's the route we go, then does it get, like, is there an appeal mechanism, or it gets filed that way, and then people can ask for a bump up and say this is, I guess in that case, potentially the developer will say that, you know, they want a bump up. If we say yes to the recommendation, it's potential that the community will ask for a bump up. Is that, I think it's important that we have some clarification on process.
I think Mr. Reedman wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, through the chair, and so we would need to modify the recommendation. So depending if council chose to defer the road, we would amend the environmental study report to say council directed, you know, the filing of the EA with that modification. It would be appealable by parties, so a part to order request could be asked for as part of the review. The one thing that the ministry has been very clear on is frivolous appeals are not considered, so there has to be a grounding in fault in the study or in the process to file an appeal and to have it considered for merit. And then the minister would make a recommendation to staff and council on the next steps in the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic. Okay, I have 3 councillors in the, are you all wanting to make comments or any more questions? Questions or comments, excuse me. Do I need to do that one? Okay. Councillor Deneau?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I often use this phrase that I want to live in a world where we're proactive as opposed to being reactive. I'm not sure that'll ever happen. But what I'm hearing from staff is we don't know all the negative impacts that putting this road would have. Flooding, loss of nature, potential loss of wildlife. We just passed a budget a couple weeks ago, and we went above what the base amount was to pave our trails, to create more trails, and we have one here. It's already done. Like, we don't have to do anything to it. We don't have to touch the trail. I'm having, I have a hard time. We are in a bit of a climate emergency, but if we continue to tear down our wetlands or our trees, and it's going to have a negative impact. So, we can talk about dollars and cents all you want, but in 30 years, if we don't have a planet to live on, what did we save $1 million for, $2 million for? To quote Ontario Nature, there are less than 30% of PSWs remaining in southern Ontario. It's a form of natural infrastructure, and the wetlands contribute over $50 billion in economic benefits. Bill 23, which we know we do not like, it will actually make it more difficult to designate and protect wetlands as a PSW. So I think as a city, we have to do better than some of our other counterparts who are elected in this province, and we have to put the betterment of our community environmentally ahead of maybe road may detract some from another road, but I want to look at the environmental impact of it. And I'm not an environmentalist by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm also a parent with young children, and I want to have a world for them to actually have clean air and places to go and walk. And so I think we need to kind of take some of that into consideration of what we're actually doing here as far as impacting the overall environment of our city, and that's all.
Thank you, Councillor Deneau. And with the indulgence of council, my apologies. I should have, before we started comments, I should have asked first to have whether there's a mover for the recommendation. Sorry?
Carry on.
There's.
He'll move it.
You're moving? Oh, okay.
I actually am thinking that, we've asked for a few pieces of additional information to come forward between now and the 27th. And so I'm inclined to move a deferral to the 27th so that we have that additional information before we make a decision. I think in doing that, though, I'm holding off so that people can make comments if they want to do that. So I'll hold that deferral motion.
Can you hold a deferral, or do we do that first?
No, I can hold it. Yep.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mayor Urbanovic. I'll go to Councillor Chapman next.
Thank you. I was actually going to call for a deferral, which I think is longer, gives more time for staff to respond to some of the questions. I'd like to see more information about regarding alternative servicing options rather than the one that's being proposed here. I'd also like to see, I guess regarding traffic, we have great traffic staff, and they do a great job at managing, problem areas. So I think we have to trust that that's not a big problem in this case, that, traffic's going to be heavier here or there, because we have ways to respond to that. I think I'd like more information about the directional drilling and, a comprehensive overview of it. I'd like also, we talk about geotechnical assessment being a next stage. Well, maybe it's a stage that has to be addressed now. And I would like to see further reconsideration for the Robert Ferry to Strasbourg extension, and then a potential traffic study after that's happened. So I don't know if all that can be done now, between now and the council meeting, but if not, I think we're talking about a bit more time that's going to be required.
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. Councillor Owodunni.
Thank you very much. In addition to the deferral request, I do agree with that. But in terms of the report that is coming back to us, Councillor Schneider, earlier mentioned just around flooding in the homes in that area. I think it's something that I would love to be added to that report. I think one of the responses we received from staff, we're not sure about that. It would be great to find out more if we can get some more information, just in addition to some of the requests that are coming in. So that way, if we're making a request, as Councillor Deneau mentioned, if we can be proactive and know all the risk ahead as best as possible before we go into this, it will really help us make a sound decision around this. So please, if you can add flooding to, what do we call that, study on flooding, a flooding study? A flood stud? I don't know, but you know what I'm talking about.
Thank you, Councillor Owodunni. Councillor Davey.
Yeah, thank you. I want to start by thanking the delegates for coming and making their very educated presentations. I just want to say, like, situations like this, I hate being in, because we are bound by the decisions that were made 20, 30 years ago. If I'm being honest, I've been looking at Google Maps here, this entire subdivision. On Bean Drive, everything south of Marl Meadow, looks like the entire subdivision, and the crescents along it were all built in a wetland. The reality is, to the delegate that's teaching civics, I would like to think that I wouldn't have approved the subdivision at the time if they had the knowledge back then that we know today, but that would mean that many of our homes wouldn't even be there. Anyway, what we're left with is infrastructure challenges that where it literally, the infrastructure that's been built ends at the very end of this road. And there's no other route, if we're believing our professional staff, which we must do, there's no other route for at least the pipes to go through. So right now, the question, as I see it, is the pipes versus the pavement going through there. I would also add, in terms of council not caring, the alternative that was passed to us went through, I asked that question very specifically in terms of the wetland being affected. And my rough calculations shows it's actually about a third. It went from roughly 1,500 feet from alternative 4 back in the day to around 400 feet going through the wetland today. It's progress. Are we happy with that? No, we're not. But the questions I need answered hopefully will come between now and committee, and I would only add, I know there's been a lot of information added. I'm aware of the impacts to the wetland, but the one question I would like staff to come back with, if it's possible, even if it's your professional estimate, is the question about salt and the additional routes. So if they can do some modeling in terms of if this road is built versus if it's not built, will there be more salt going into the groundwater or less salt? Because I'm hearing two different methods. Yes, more salt going into the wetland, but will there be more salt overall, more carbon emissions of cars going around if the road is not built? So I'm hoping to get that information back as well, because really at the end of the day, I think that we have no choice but to build the pipe, but the question about the pavement is up in the air.
Thank you, Councillor Davey. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Councillor Davey, you said pretty much everything that I wanted to say. We did, as a council, declare a climate emergency, and with that comes some responsibility for the decisions we make. So I'm glad that we have a deference in action now, and we can get some more information. I am concerned about the displacement of the groundwater, and it's difficult making a decision, not knowing that until we make the decision and things begin. So I'm glad we have this has been deferred and we have a little bit more time. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Schneider. Mayor Urbanovic.
Thanks. So originally I was going to defer this to council on the 27th, but I'm hearing, a number of requests that are being asked, and I guess my question to staff is, do you need, I'm seeing someone saying stretch it out. So our next council meeting would see it come back March 20th. Does that work, or do we need longer than that? After March 20th, just for the record, the next meeting is on April 23rd. Oh, no, sorry, I'm wrong month, hang on. Is on April 17th in terms of council.
Mr. Reedman?
Through the chair, so we could report back by March 20th on the impacts or provide feedback on the additional questions that's being asked.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that's my motion then, Madam Chair.
Okay. Do we have a seconder? We don't need a seconder. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Okay. So council just moved and voted to refer the recommendations and the questions that we had from today's meeting to a council meeting on March 20th, and it will come back that evening. And I just wanted to thank everyone this evening as well for your delegations, your passion, how much you care about this community, and it was great to hear from you, and we'll be back again on the 20th. Thank you. And that we need a mover to thank you, Councillor Singh, and we will dissolve this committee and move on to the next one. Thank you. Oh, all those in favor? Thank you. 10 minutes.